All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is the 1:30 work session of the Larimer County Board of Commissioners. Is that what this is? It is. This is our work session regarding the 2019 revised budget and the 2020 proposed budget. I am Tom Donnelly. I am the chairman of the Board of Commissioners this year. I'm joined by John Kafalis, Commissioner from District 1, Steve Johnson, Commissioner from District 2, and our county manager, Linda Hoffman, is there at the control panels to broadcast this hearing. We're going to hear from our budget director in just a few moments, but before we begin, I'm going to actually ask Commissioner Kafalis to introduce our guests who are with us today, and maybe we just take a moment to recognize the folks who've been spending the day with us here in the Larimer County Courthouse, and see how their day has gone. So would you like to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just take a moment. So there are four people, or there are a few people observing today's meeting, but the guests are Katie and Daryl, and Katie works for Easter Seals, and Daryl works with Katie, and they are part of our Disability Placement Day, Ability Placement Day, excuse me. And so there are 11 individuals who are involved with Easter Seals, and in some cases Foothills Gateway, and in the community, and they've been here shadowing us as part of our Ability Placement Day. And I've had the pleasure and privilege to spend a few hours with Katie and Daryl, showing them what county government does, explaining to them how smart the county commissioners are,
yeah.
and how we work together really well. And so it's been a great day, and I'm glad that they're going to observe about a half hour of the budget hearing, and then there's a meeting upstairs that folks will participate in.
Well, very good. So Daryl, have you had a good day here at the county?
Yes, sir, I have.
And you met some interesting folks?
Yes, sir, I have.
Very good. Well, probably not the least of which is us. So good. Well, we're glad to have you, and we appreciate you and your folks coming in and spending the day with us.
I appreciate you guys letting me come visit.
And it's I'll just say this: it's pretty brave to speak in front of a lot of people you don't know, and most people aren't very comfortable doing that. So the fact that you're here and you're talking to us it's impressive, and it shows how brave of a person you are. And so thanks a lot for doing that. And I wanted to know if you would be interested in having a picture taken with the county commissioners to put on Facebook. Okay, well, let's take just a couple-minute break, and we're going to go do that right now, since we know you're not going to stay for the whole boring budget meeting, and I wish I was going with you, but I'm going to have to stay. So let's go step out in the lobby for just a second. I'm going to introduce our budget director, Josh Fudge. But maybe before I do, I'll just say, every year, county government is required by state law to prepare and pass a budget. And that budget has to be a balanced budget. We have projected revenues. We cannot borrow or deficit spend, except in very specific instances where we have voter approval to do so. So the preparation of a budget is a very big deal. It's only a half an hour to approve it every December, but these guys work literally all year long to develop it, and it's really a lot of people have described it this way to me, and I agree with them. They say a budget is really a moral document, and I believe it is a moral document for a couple of reasons. It's the way that we invest your hard-earned tax dollars, right? You don't have a choice whether you're going to pay taxes or not. You have to pay them, and so for us, we have an incredible obligation on behalf of the people to pay those taxes, to use their money wisely and invest it in a way that they will get a tremendous return, or the best possible return on that investment that they can. And so we take that very seriously. The county government does a lot of things, especially outside of this room, frankly. We do a lot of social service types of programs. We do a lot of public health types of programs. We do a lot of public safety programs. And the undersheriff has actually joined us today, and it's good to see him again 2 times in a week. And so this is really the document that envisions how those services will be provided throughout the year. And so a lot of work has gone into this. There's been meetings with every single department here in the county, as well as several meetings with the Board of County Commissioners to get us to this point. And so it's a big undertaking, and so we're nearing the end, and then we'll start it all over again. So with that, I guess I'll turn it over to you, Josh, and you can make some introductory remarks if you'd like.
All right, thank you. Well, again, my name is Josh Fudge. I'm the County Budget Director. I'm joined by our Senior Budget Analyst, Matt Bohannon. And I just want to thank Matt and all the folks out in the departments and the County Commissioners and Linda and everybody else for their work as we put this together in your direction. And so, as you can see from the agenda, we'll just walk through some of the key initiatives that are in the budget for next year, a broad summary of the expenses and revenues, a graph showing the TIF as a percentage of gross assessed value, which is kind of fun this year because it actually is trending downward instead of upward. Highlights of our capital budget, and then service proposals, which are those items that requested and would have funding or supplemental funding in the proposed budget, and then a review of the calendar.
So I'll start with the 2020 initiatives, and before I do that, I just wanted to chime in with my appreciation to all of the departments and offices who put together great balanced budgets that met their targets, and thoughtful service proposals, some of which you will see have been recommended in the budget. And a special thanks to Josh and Matt, how they juggle all these details and get the numbers right each year, year after year. And this year, win the GFOA award is pretty impressive. So we're fortunate to have the two of them, and it's a little startling to realize we have 2 guys managing a $500 million budget. But because they do it so well, it's just another way that Larimer County is conservative with our resources and wise in who we hire. So thank you for your expertise. A couple of main themes in the 2020 initiatives this year. One is the new strategic plan. The county's 5-year strategic plan cycle is from 2019 through 2023. So in the first year of this budget, or in the first year of the strategic plan cycle, we have done a lot of work to organize and get started, and so that means that some of the initiatives are beginning to get fleshed out in 2020. And so you'll find several service proposals associated with that strategic plan work. Those are in the categories of data sharing and analysis, which is a real theme in this year's budget. We have been stressing data sharing, database decision making, and the analysis of data, not just as a a linear function, but as really more of a problem-solving function. So you'll see that as a theme, and it's certainly reflected in our strategic plan. The housing and child care study marries two of our strategic plan objectives, one having to do with the cost of housing and the other having to do with the availability of child care. So this study will be done to look at the relationship between those two issues, and will also make tangible recommendations for what to do moving forward. We're working on an inclusionary job coach. So we have a strategic plan objective dealing with employment of persons with disabilities, and we have a different strategic plan objective having to do with growing characteristics of the future for our staff as a whole. And one of the characteristics that we're looking for developing in our staff through appropriate recruitment, training, professional growth, and promotion is the issue of being inclusionary. So you'll see that as one of the service proposals that is favorably reviewed. And then, of course, we'll be doing community health resilience mapping, which looks at neighborhoods as a way of measuring their well-being and also helping to target services in those areas appropriately. The other main theme under our initiatives is our continued program of trying to address the considerable gap we have in available facilities. Nobody wants to build buildings, but at the same time, we all want there to be effective service delivery, and at some point, those two things go hand in hand. So with our new solid waste master plan, we will begin finishing design and maybe even breaking construction on some of our new solid waste facilities in 2020 that will take us into services for the future. Our behavioral health facility will break ground in 2020, and we'll be doing work to implement the ranch master plan as well. So another main theme or initiative in the 2020 budget is our continued focus on public safety. Some of that is has to do, again, with building projects such as the jail improvement project, securing space for an emergency operations center that's a 24/7 facility, but also fleshing out some of our equipment, some of our practices, and that would include body-worn cameras in the sheriff's office, criminal justice services in response to new state laws, district attorney staffing, also having to do with increase in workload and the new district judge that will be joining us in 2020 in district court. The coroner's office staffing also needs supplemental support, and then we put it under safety because it seems like flood recovery is safety related, and so we think, and I said someplace, I don't remember where it was, that for 3 years I have said in the transmittal letter for the budget to the public that this year we're going to be finishing flood recovery work. So I'll say it again, and maybe the third time will be the charm. This year we're going to be finishing flood recovery work because we think that we'll finally have the obligations of FEMA funding that we've been working so hard on to achieve for the last 2 or 3 years. So those are the big themes or the big initiatives, and if there's any question or comment or from the commissioners on those, we should talk about that now before we turn it over to Josh and Matthew for the nitty-gritty. Hearing none.
Right. So walking through a high-level overview of the expenditures, in the budget we break out our expenses by certain categories, and 5 of those are what we call service categories within our net operating budget. And that's really the budget to provide those day-to-day services, our ongoing operations, and things like that. There are 3 other categories. One is capital projects, and we divide those out between disaster response and non-disaster response, and then disaster recovery, and then non-operational accounts, which are things like our internal services, so that would double count expenses like health insurance and fleet and transfers between funds and things like that, and also expenses related to where we collect funds either for Foothills Gateway or the municipalities for the open land sales tax and then disperse those funds to those. So the net operating budget for the county in the 2020 proposed budget would be $289.4 million. And the gross expenses, the entire budget would be about $575.6 million. From what I can tell, that would be a record, and that's largely because of that line for capital projects, about $187.5 million. Within that is about $171 million of actual project spending, and I'll get into the capital projects a little bit later. But there are really, and as we saw in the previous slide, some very significant capital projects that'll be coming up here in 2020. So public safety, as always, is the largest service category within the operating budget at about $92.4 million. That includes the Office of the Sheriff, the District Attorney, the Coroner, Criminal Justice Services, which is alternative sentencing and community corrections. And then Human and Economic Health, which is largely our Human Services Department, our Health Department. Economic Development and Cooperative Extension is second at about $75 million. Community Planning, Infrastructure and Resources, which is things like road and bridge, the fairgrounds, natural resources, community development, and those things is $65 million. Support Services, which is largely those internal services like the Budget Office, Finance, Human Resources, and IT is next at $38.2. And finally, Public Records and Information is about $18.4, and that includes the Office of the Clerk and Recorder, the Office of the Treasurer, the Office of the Assessor, public communication, and those types of things. So in 2020, breaking out the budget by expenses, and this is a little bit different way of looking at it. There are certain categories of expenses such as personnel, which are obviously staff related, non-personnel operating costs, which are things like contracts and things like that. These can flow across any of the service categories that I mentioned previously. And so these are two of them. The first is personnel costs, which increase about 5.5% or $9.6 million in 2020. This is a combination of compensation cost increases, some of which you approved in July, salary increases for next year. We received some great news on health insurance, which is only rising about 3%, which is much lower than it has been in recent years. And then it also includes new positions, some of which I'll walk through with the service proposals. But one of the largest components of that is the first phase of the jail improvement project, beginning to create those positions and hire those deputies that will eventually man the new or the improved facility. And so just for that alone is about 34 and a half positions staggered throughout the year, some to begin in January and then 3 months later and 3 months later and things like that. And those positions are about $1.6 million next year. And then there is a provision to provide step increases for sheriff's sworn office staff because of simply the market-based and retention and things like that. And that's about $518,000. For those non-personnel operating costs, they increase by about $10.3 million. One of the largest provisions in that is the behavioral health services, now that that's wrapping up, increased by about $1.7 million next year for their master plan and those community-based services. And then somewhat confusingly, a lot of our capital projects use expenditure accounts that we consider operating accounts. And so things like road maintenance contracts, that might be a capital project in road and bridge, but it's considered an operating account. Solid waste, $10 million, their project to begin construction of their new facilities. They've used an operating account for those items. So that's why you see those costs, that's largely why you see those increasing by about $10 million. And then we have a set of accounts which referred to as capital outlay, and those increase quite substantially, almost 200% or about $88 million. Those are largely because of the four large projects you see listed here. The jail improvement would be $50 million next year. Replacement of the Vine Street campus, almost $30 million. Construction of the Behavioral Health Center at $17 million. And then the Ranch Master Plan at about $11.2 million. So obviously, again, the capital budget and implementing those master plans is starting to come to fruition here in the 2020 budget. Debt service payments increased by about $1.4 million over the 2019 revised budget. The planned issuance of the COPs to pay for the jail project will require an initial payment of about $6 million next year. We had $4.2 million, but I'm sorry, $4.9 million budgeted this year. Because the COPs are being issued later in the year, we won't need to make that payment. So over the revised budget, that's an increase of $6 million. On the other hand, the ranch fairgrounds debt payments will be complete this year, $3.9 million, which will go away next year. So that is the most of the change. There are some minor payments related to improvement districts.
So Josh, can you remind me how much we took from reserves for the jail project?
For the jail improvement project, initially back in 2018, there was about $5 million to start that. However, once it was determined to go ahead with a $75 million project, there aren't any more reserves being used for that specific project. Those will be that will be funded through the COPs. The reserves instead will be used for the Fleet Campus, $30 million, of which I think $14 million was from the general fund.
Okay. I saw there was a big drop in the general fund. I couldn't remember which project it was for.
Yeah, for 2019, I think it was $14 million for Vine Street and then $8 million for the satellite shops.
Okay.
Interfund transfers decreased by about $25 million, and it's a good segue to this. There's that large one-time general fund transfer for 2019, offset by a smaller transfer of about $4.4 million. That's for the Emergency Operations Center next year. Also, the portions of the Information Technology Department, some of those corporate services have been moved from an internal services fund into the general fund. So that reduces expenses coming from the general fund of about $8 million. Instead, now that those services are just budgeted directly in the general fund. So that's why those transfers decrease so
And
much.
the 22 million transfer is for what again?
14 million was for Vine Street replacement and 8 was for satellite
Okay.
shops. So on the revenue side, property tax revenues will increase by about 15% or about $18 million. That's for the county operating purposes. It does not include Foothills Gateway or the improvement districts that may have their own mill levies. The valuation increased by about 18.2%. The largest component or largest percentage increase was oil and gas, increased by nearly 5 times or more than 5 times.
And that was about $6 million, is that right?
Of $3.5 million of property tax revenue
3.5,
Yeah.
okay.
Is the increase.
is the value of the increase, yes. Vacant land rose by 25%, residential rose by 18%, and all others rose by about 11%. And so those increases in the assessed values are offset by the one-time mill levy credit of about $3.5 million in 2020. Sales, use, and special ownership taxes would decrease in the budget by about 1% or $320,000. That's really because of our conservative budgeting of those revenues. They're doing quite healthy so far this year, but we like to keep those revenues basically flat on a budget basis from year to year. External charges for services, so those are things that the public pays to the county to use our services or our facilities. Things like fees to deposit solid waste or campground rentals and things like that. Those increased by about 2%. Again, that's really just because of conservative budgeting of those revenues. It decreases the most in solid waste. There's also some decreases in motor vehicle and things like that. So those would decrease by about 2% from the revised budget. And then the interest earnings declined by about $233,000 from the revised budget to about $4.3 million. The 19 revised budget is about $4.5 million. And again, this is really just because of conservative revenue estimates. Through 2019, we've already received about $5 million in interest earnings. License and permit revenue is down about 2% or $176,000. That's because of a reduction in transportation expansion fees of about $430,000, which would be offset by increases in building permits based on recent activity by about $250,000. Debt proceeds would be eliminated in 2020. We had the one issuance, $75.5 million for the jail improvement project that will go away in 2020. So overall in the budget, the revenues are lower than expenses by about $110.5 million. And that's really a reverse of the 2019 budget. Because we received the COP revenues on a one-time basis, we're going to start spending those down. We moved some funding like the $22 million into the capital projects fund for projects, and now we're going to start spending those down in 2020. So it's really just a flip-flop of the 2019 budget. And it's really using those one-time revenues for our capital projects. So the next chart, which we routinely show, is tax increment financing value as a percent of gross assessed. The county has seen a pretty substantial rise in the percentage of value or percentage of property tax revenue that's intercepted by these tax increment financing districts. It rose from just over 2% of value just 7 years ago to over 5%. However, 2020 would be the first time it's decreased in quite some time, down to about 5.2% from 2019. And that's largely because of the increase in oil and gas value, none of which is in those TIF districts. So the county will receive the full benefit of that.
So when do our tax increment financing districts start to remit their property tax, full property tax? What are the years? When does Centerra?
When do they expire?
Yes.
So they expire, I think Centerra expires in 2029 and Timnath in 2030.
So, and for 2020, about $7.2 million will be diverted from the county to those tax increment financing districts. So to provide some highlights of the capital budget, we have 5 categories of projects. The first is capital renewal, which is basically replacing those things that the county already owns. It may be renovating an existing facility, but just to kind of keep it as it currently is without expanding its use or things like that. It's very important that the county invest in these types of things, replacing vehicles, replacing software, replacing components at our facilities. I can tell you from experience, if you don't do that, the longer they go, then they have to be replaced at even higher cost. Capital expansion will be by far the largest in 2020, and that's from improving things like the jail, expanding their use, building a new fleet shop to replace the Vine Street facility, building a new behavioral health facility in 2020. Disaster projects would be about $12.6 million next year. That's for 2 remaining projects, 44H and County Road 47, that have been around for quite some time. Capital studies, which would be about $10 million in 2020. That's almost entirely for solid waste. That project is kind of evolving from studying what needs to be done at the landfill and the new facility to really starting construction. And so you'll see that project move up to capital expansion in future years. And then finally is land and real asset acquisition at about $13.8 million next year. And that's for purchasing things like easements, land, a new building, such as the Emergency Operations Center and things like that. So the total between disaster and all the other projects on actual stuff, not just moving funding around, will be about $184 million in 2020. And right now in the plan, we have about $493 million of expenses over the 5-year period from 2020 to 2024. I put this chart in here. This is for the capital budget. We do have some costs that we put in disaster recovery and capital projects that aren't actually purchasing the things that these capital projects buy. And that's really because we tend to have to move some money around, which count as expenditures in the budget. So we pull those out and put them in the capital service category because we would not be making those expenses in our budget if not for the capital projects. So this chart just really shows how we get to that 184. There's about 188 million, for instance, in non-disaster capital costs. About $16 million of that is moving funding around to finance those projects, which leaves a net of about 171.4 million on actual stuff for non-disaster. Same in disaster, about $3.9 million of that is moving funding really from our natural disaster fund over to Road and Bridge to reimburse them for the county's local share. The net cost on actual stuff is about 12.6, which adds up to 184 million. So just some highlights by department. Road and Bridge has the largest number of projects at 25, while facilities, as you might expect with the jail improvement in Vine Street, has the largest value at about $87 million. Natural Resources has several projects which are generally small in nature, followed by information technology, the ranch, solid waste, one in behavioral health, and all others. So a total of about 76 projects in 2020 with $184 million in expenses. Just some highlights briefly for capital renewal. Again, investing in replacement and maintenance of things we already own. Business software replacement would be about $3.9 million. Various projects at the ranch, replacing some of their components, $3 million. Replacing vehicles, $3 million. The countywide replacement plan, which is those small equipment items, is about 2.8. The natural resources, facilities, and road and bridge make up the remainder. Capital expansion, there are 29 projects in this category, the largest of which sort of listed already: the jail improvement, Vine Street, behavioral health, the ranch master plan kicking off, paving County Road 72 from US 287 to County Road 21. North of Fort Collins here will be about $6 million in 2020. And then one of the, I think the final year in 2020 of the I-25 expansion project will be about $2.8 million. Land and real asset acquisition projects, open space and natural areas, budgets for possible land purchases and easements of nearly $8 million. Purchase and tenant improvements to an emergency operations center would be about $4.9 million, of which we have budgeted an assumed grant from DOLA of about $500,000 to cover some of those costs. And then road and bridge, water, and aggregate resources would be about 1.2. The capital study project out at solid waste is about $10 million. And finally, those two disaster projects that hopefully we won't be seeing in future years is at $12.6 million.
The reason that we're spending so much time on the capital expenditures is because these are really the investments for the future for our community. So this board has really been focused on keeping our belts tight on operational costs and instead shifting our focus to things that will serve as investments for the community for decades or generations to come. So it's very unusual for a local government to spend, in this case, about 35% of the budget on capital investments. And I think that's a real testament to the philosophy of the board of investing in the future rather than simply chewing up the money with operational costs.
So then going back to the operating budget, we solicit service proposals from our departments where they can request funding beyond what they need to basically continue their ongoing operations. For 2020, we received 46 service proposals that requested a total of about $5 million in expenses and just over $4.3 million in general fund support. Of those requests, the items that I'll go through, you can see have just under $3 million of general fund support. So very discerning on those service proposals. We have basically three categories of those. Capacity expansion are really designed to respond to demand or any legal changes or things like that to basically continue the existing service level. Those are kind of the proposals that we look at funding first in general. We want to maintain those service levels even as demand changes. So those are about $1.6 million of general fund support. Next is strategic plan goals. which we've walked through a little bit, and we'll walk through a little more in a little bit. That's about $668,000 in general fund support. And finally, service expansion, which is basically improving our service levels or providing new services, are kind of the third priority, and those add up to about $722,000 of general fund support. So starting off with the capacity expansion service proposals, I'll walk through these briefly, and if you have any questions, just stop me. In the Office of the County Manager, there would be creation of an internship program. The funding, the local match for that would be absorbed within the existing budget, so no additional funding for that. There is funding in community development for the Larimer Humane Society contract, which does include a small bit of funding for a subsidy for, I believe it's low-income seniors, for their licenses and things like that. That's about $68,000. Community development would also implement electronic plan review, so they can start taking those plans and things like that electronically and share them with their staff electronically, which should really help make their operations more efficient. The Office of the Coroner would add, I believe it's 2 positions and a vehicle, which would be about $167,000 in 2020, of which about $41,000 is on a one-time basis to purchase that. The district attorney would receive 3 positions at about $277,000. I believe that's 2 assistant district attorneys and 1 legal aide position as they continue to see their caseload grow. In engineering, you see the 3 proposals there. One, to create a stormwater right-of-way tech, which is really in response to a state mandate in the way we manage our stormwater regulations. Creation of an improvement district tech position, and then construction management software. They currently have, on a trial basis, licenses for construction management, and with all the projects that are going to be implemented here in the coming years, that project was worthwhile. Next on the list, in facilities, an increase in their administrative staff as they have taken on responsibility for managing more of our facilities, managing utility bills and things like that, and because of the capital projects and improvements that are coming up, they would increase that position, I think, by a quarter. They would absorb that in their existing budget. Finance would create a sales tax accounting tech, which would be funded through sales tax revenues. And then in finance and road and bridge, share this position. This is continuing a limited term position that's managing all the reimbursements and costs related to these disasters, which is obviously extremely important, so we can make sure we are reimbursed for our costs. In human resources, there's a benefits team lead that is currently funded out of the benefits fund. The remainder of that staff, the benefits administration, was moved to the general fund some time ago, so this is a cleanup of that. The law enforcement step plan adjustment described earlier is just over $500,000. Providing funding to veteran services for their administrative costs that they share with the Workforce Center and has been subsidized by the Workforce Center would be about $87,000. And then about $25,500 is provided to continue a high school equivalency program in the Workforce Center, which unfortunately has had to be curtailed because of federal funding. That funding, that $25,500, would be budgeted in a non-departmental account, and then we would ask the Workforce Center to come back with a recommendation on how to best use those resources. For strategic plan goals, Linda kind of described them at the beginning, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but you see the 4 there. There's a business analyst and data project, about $191,000. There's one-time funding for the 2 projects, community health and resilience mapping, and then the strategic analysis of child care and housing, about $414,000 in 2020. And then the position for inclusionary job coaching, which would begin in April, would be about $62,000. Any questions on those? All right. Finally, for service expansion, Criminal Justice Services has 3. One is to increase victim witness staffing. One is to provide more pretrial services staffing. This, in retrospect, this may have better served as a capacity expansion, but regardless, they're facing increasing demands on their time, and so need to increase staffing for to provide consistent supervision levels, and then records management staffing at about $37,000. Again, this is basically related to a state mandate that makes expunging records for criminal and I believe civil cases easier and likely will increase the workload in CJS. Community Development has three service proposals that will have no impact on the general fund. They're funded by permitting or fee revenue. One would add, I believe it's 3 positions to begin or to take over from the state the inspection and permitting for electrical projects related to electricity. This is currently, I'm sorry?
Okay. We'll get there.
Okay. This is currently done by the state, and from what we've heard, the service level is not all that great provided by the state, and so the county has the ability to take that over, and it would be funded by user fees. One would be a planner one for Estes Valley. That would be absorbed within the existing budget for community development for services in the unincorporated area around Estes Park. And finally, short-term rental, limited-term staffing to basically get those regulations and licensing up and running, and that position would be funded by permitting fees as well. Finance would receive about $18,000 to engage a consultant to develop our cost allocation plan, which is what we use to basically seek reimbursement from programs that are funded through outside revenues for internal costs, things like the budget office, human resources, finance, information technology, and things like that. And finally, at least for this page, an increase in costs for election workers due to basically rule changes for taxes for these temporary election workers would be about $108,000 in 2020. This will be a very cyclical cost related to the election cycle. So in 2021, this will be far less because we'll need far less election workers.
Not all counties will incur this cost. The reason that we incur this election worker admin cost is largely because we outsource payroll, and so we have to keep those election workers in the payroll system and therefore pay the licensing fee through the end of the year when their W-2s are prepared.
Yep.
So it's a substantial cost for us that was frankly a surprise. I don't think anybody realized that this was going to be incurred, but now that we understand what the law requires and what our payroll vendor requires, we're staring this $108,000 down, and we have to pay it.
No choice.
On these, both the short-term rental staffing and the Estes Valley planner for sure, this was assuming that we would shift to a system where the planner would be a fairly junior level planner and would be taking over the routine processing under a code that we were familiar with. And so if that approach changes from what was expected last summer, then these positions and the costs would change as well.
So finally, in human resources, there would be an increase in the ability or increase in existing position that currently provides internal communication. That's about $17,000 to make that a full-time position. There would be about $330,000 provided to IT to improve our network infrastructure security, especially from ransomware attacks and things of that nature. Of that $330,000, about $230,000 is one time in 2020. And then about $8,000 to public affairs for the community survey, which is a every other year cost.
Josh, were there service proposals in capital, developing capital programs as well?
So there were basically yes, there were capital project requests, almost all of which are included in the capital improvements plan. There was one that was not, that was in facilities. They had requested additional funds for their security, kind of hardening our facilities and things like that. We kind of wanted to take a wait-and-see approach on that. They're doing an audit or a study right now of what might be necessary, and so we felt it might be better for that to be completed first.
Okay.
The body-worn cameras project is in the capital plan as well as a large one-time item. So with that, the final slide is the review of the calendar. This month and into November, the budget will be discussed at community meetings. We have 2 public hearings, one on November 4th, one on November 6th, both at 6:30 p.m. November 4th will be here at the courthouse offices down on the first floor, and the one on Wednesday the 6th will be at the municipal building in Estes Park. On November 12th, there is a budget direction retreat to provide additional direction as things change or as we hear things at the public hearing. On December 10th at Admin Matters, we'll review any final budget changes that you desire to make. And then on December 20th at 1:30 p.m., the 2020 budget would be adopted. And that is all I have.
Were you going to talk about revisions to 2019 today? That's what the schedule says. Or are we going to do that in December 10th?
I can. I didn't have a specific slide for
Okay.
it.
I don't know that it's that interesting.
Okay.
But, I mean, at some point we should do that before. Well, certainly before adoption. I don't know about. We do cover that in budget hearings, don't we?
Too.
Yes.
That might actually be good enough for us. If I hear it there, I'm fine, I think.
Okay. Yeah, we can provide more detailed information at those 2 public hearings in that presentation.
Okay. They're largely, I noticed, and from looking at just the little bit of time I've had this, I've noticed they're largely around scheduling of capital
Yeah,
projects
overwhelmingly.
and when they came online, when we received revenue for them.
Mhm.
So the COPs, you mentioned that briefly about the revenue comes in, and is that shown as revenue when they're issued, which I assume would be 2020?
19.
2019, they'll be
Have the
received.
revenue in 2019?
Yes. Yep, there's about $75.5 million of revenue in the 2019 budget. If you looked at Fund 512 in the back of the
Okay.
document, you'd see the big revenue, not terribly large expenses in Fund 512 in 2019, which results in a huge fund balance, which then carries into 2020.
Yeah, $75 million.
Yep,
Yeah.
and we start to spend that down.
Okay. And the expenditures would show up in 2020 and 2021
Yes.
probably
Yep.
then? Okay.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. What kind of community outreach will we be doing? Will we put this information about the budget hearings, for example, in the Larimer County, the end of the month newsletter, The Connection? What kind of outreach will we do, Josh and Matthew?
So we have the 2 public hearings. We have the community events that you all do where we can come and be your guests. And we put the budget is up on the website. There's a spotlight on the front page now that says it's available.
But how will, unless folks are budget geeks, how will they know to look at the website or attend the budget hearings? I know we'll put out a notice about the community conversations, the community meetings.
Media does.
Social media, too. We
Social
do a lot of
media,
social
yeah.
media.
Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe there could be some collaboration with public affairs folks to
Oh,
put
there
out.
always is.
Yeah.
Pardon?
The Public Affairs Group always puts together a press release and sends out information, and then they put that on our Facebook page and they tweet that. And so through a combination of traditional and social media, we publicize that the budget is published and that the hearings will be conducted. We also do the same with most of the commissioner community conversations or citizen meetings or whatever titles they bear will between now and the end of the year discuss the budget to the extent that it's desired by the commissioners.
And for
Sorry, go ahead.
for non-budget geeks, we also have the Budget in Brief, which is it's a brochure or a pamphlet with infographics about the budget and some major programs we're doing. It's more accessible
For 2019, correct?
For 2020.
for 2020.
For 2020.
Now for 2020?
Similar to the community report in style and
Oh, we have a 2020 one.
Yes.
yeah.
Be nice. Do we have hard copies of that?
Yeah, that'll go to the printer hopefully today and
Okay.
be ready.
Just want to make
early.
sure that we didn't change anything dramatically. Probably,
Right.
yeah. Didn't get cold feet. Okay. Anything else? Questions?
Sir.
Looks great. Good work, guys. All right.
Thank you.
Lynn, anything else?
Not today, Commissioner. Thank you
Thanks.
again, gentlemen.
Thanks, Budget Department, and thanks, County Departments, for putting together a great budget. And board's adjourned.